Hello, it's been a while since I've made a video, and well, I've always wanted to do one about the max distance options with the MIA material X within Mental Ray. And so I've got a scene set up here that's to mimic a picture I found. I did a Google image search for colored glass, and I saw this one where you see these different pieces of glass. Or it may be plastic, I'm not sure. But you can see that they're stacked on top of each other a little bit, and you can see how the color is affected um, as you look at the different layers. And you can create this effect with the max distance options within the MIA material. So let's take a look at this object here. I've got 5 squares set up. This one doesn't have the special material applied to it yet. I'm going to show you how I created these materials by applying it to this one. So, but first let's take a look at this one, and let's check out its material. So you see I have a MIA material X passes material applied to this object, and for the purposes of this video it doesn't need to be the passes version of the shader, but that's just what I've used. And you can see in the refraction, advanced refraction section, I have use max distance enabled and use color at max distance. It defaults to both of these being off. So when you turn these options on, it's going to adjust the color of your refractions, where in this case it's going to be the max distance is 0.3. So that means that this particular square is, I believe I made it 0.25 centimeters in thickness. So you can think of the front surface here as 0, and then this back surface as 0.25 centimeters. And max distance is 0.3, so that means relative to where the camera is looking, so the camera sees this as 0, so if right here, 0, and we're going to start counting from 0 to 0.3. By the time we've reached a thickness of 0.3, which in this case is going to be beyond the part, it's going to apply the maximum value of this color here, this blue. And up in front, it's just going to be white. So we're going to start at white and fade to this blue color. And what that creates is the effect of a blue piece of glass. And these ones have a different color. So I've got a blue, I have a green, a yellow, and a orangish looking material. So let's apply another material to this object, which currently just has the default shader on it. So what I've done is I just right click, say assign new material, and I want to choose Mental Ray Material X or Material X Passes, and we'll give this a name. This will be red. And for the preset, we're going to start with the glass solid preset, so just say replace. And all this stuff we'll leave alone. We're going to come down to the refraction section. The color, it's got this light blue kind of default. I just want this to be white. We're going to control the color with the max distance. And actually, if you mouse over this, a little help screen will pop up, and it tells you to use the color at max distance option if you want a more accurate representation of the transparency color. So we're going to come down to here, turn on use max distance, and I'm just going to put in 0.3 like I have for the other materials, and use color at max distance. And for the color, I want this one to be a red. And now here's something to keep in mind when you're using the max distance options. If I choose red right here, that's bad. And the reason is, yeah, well, I consider it a bug. I told Mental Images about this, and they said, well, you can't just do it like this. The problem is there's zeros right here. If there's a 0 value, that's going to give you an odd result. And Mental Images says, well, just change that to something that's not 0, because, you know, in real life, nothing's going to be 0. It's going to be some number, which is fine, but, I mean, I still think that's a bug. If it reads 0, then it should just assume it's a very small number and treat it that way. So let me show you what happens if we leave it at 0. I've got some weird object here set up, And this has a material with red as the max distance color. So R is 1, green and blue are both set to 0. So let's do a render and see what this looks like. Alright, so it doesn't look quite right yet. You would expect it to be more white or see-through in the thinner areas and more deep red in the thicker areas of the glass. But I haven't actually looked at my render settings yet, so first let's take a look at what's going on there. To start with, I'm just going to go up to a production preset, and after I do that, you can come down and you can see it will increase these ray trace values here. And I'm using my 2014, so this might look different if you're using 2013 or earlier. This is the new unified sampling method, which is pretty cool, but you might be used to seeing this. So in this case, it's going to have max sample level to 2, and that just will come from your production preset. But I'm going to switch it back to unified sampling. That won't affect this video, though. Alright, so one more thing, I'm going to turn on Final Gather. And alright, now that that's done, I'm going to do another render, and I'm going to pause during the render. Alright, so now we kind of have the same result as before. This should be clearer, and this should be deeper red. So clearly our use max distance is not working properly, and it's because of what I told you. These are set to 0 and they should not be. So let's just start with changing the green value. From 0, we'll change it to 0.001, which is basically the same thing as close to 0 as you can get. So we haven't changed much at all. And I'm going to save this image and do another render. Alright, well it looks different. We've got some more color variation in here, but the problem is there's no, the blue is still completely gone. So let's come in here to the blue, and let's also change that from 0 to 0.001, which essentially is no change at all. But let's see what a dramatic difference that makes in the actual render. Alright, well that's looking a little better. And it's still, the shadow doesn't quite look right, but we're going to discuss how to fix that later on in the video. But you can see the huge difference that it makes with, that's how it was before. All we did was change the 0 to a 001, which is essentially no change at all. But that little change went from here to here. So just keep that in mind. If you're ever going here to select a color for color at max distance, and you want to you're tempted to select one of these quick swatches up here, just be aware. If you click it, come down here and change anything that's 0 to a 0.001. Or just to be safe, don't select anything in here. Just create your own color and use these controls. So anything in here you're going to be safe. It's not going to give you any 0 values unless you drag like all the way to the edge of something. Just kind of stay in here. So back to our glass squares. Let me explain my scene. I've got one light. It's just a point light, and intensity is 50. I'm using a linear decay rate, and I have ray trace shadows enabled with a 0.5 radius, shadow rays at 8, and ray depth limit at 3. And that's the only light I'm using. And my render settings are, I believe I'm just using a production preset, and that's going to automatically increase some of these values down here. We're going to have to mess with these pretty soon. And I want to turn on Final Gathering, and I set this to 0.3. I think it defaults to 1, but for preview rendering, 0.3 it'll render a little faster and still look pretty good. So let's do a test render now and just see where we're at this point. So here's our first render, and immediately you can see some weird stuff like these dashed lines and just some weird dark splotches that don't really belong there, and the shadows look kind of messed up. So let's start changing things to address this. The first thing you want to do is when you're using the max distance options, you want to make sure that you go to your render settings, go to the Quality tab and come down to Shadows, and you want to change the method from Simple to Segments. And I'm not sure exactly what that does, but it has something to do with how the shadows are sorted at render time. And so let's see what just doing that one change does to our render. Alright, so that fixed that, switching our shadow method to segments. We don't have those weird black splotches anymore. It still doesn't look right in this area, so we'll have to fix that. And there's also these weird, like clearly this is reflecting this green glass piece right here, and it doesn't look right. So to fix that, let's go back to our render settings, and I'm going to increase our reflections from 4 to 8. And I'm assuming because this is a rounded square, like it's not sharp corners. There's a lot of polygons in these areas, and it just doesn't seem to have enough rays to properly show what it's supposed to look like here. So doubling this from 4 to 8, and I'm going to increase our trace depth, which is a sum of your reflection and your refraction rays. If max trace depth is set to 4 and I have 8 and 6 here, it's even though I have 8 and 6, it's still only going to allow 4 total rays as a combination of reflection and refraction. So if I want to make sure that I'm going to be allowed to use all 8 reflection rays and all 8 refractions, then I'm going to increase this to 14, which is 8 plus 4. I'm sorry, 8 plus 6. So let's see what that does. Alright, here's our new render, and if we compare it to the old one, you'll see this area was cleaned up. So we increased our reflection samples for that. And it still looks kind of funky in these areas, and I messed with a lot of settings trying to see if I can get rid of that, and it doesn't seem to want to go away. And I think this is an example of where something in real life would look like this, but if you see an object in real life, you never really stop to think that it doesn't look right, because you know it's real life. Like if this was a photograph, and if you knew this was a photograph, you'd look at it and you wouldn't really think twice about what you're seeing. Whereas on the computer, since we know this is a render, you can look at it and you'd be like, well, that doesn't look right at all. But if I look at this from the side, I can see that there is actually a lot of dark areas in here, and this could just be a product of the reflections and the refractions and shadows just getting picked up and reflected along and refracted around inside here, and this is just what it looks like right here. In real life, if you look up at the clouds sometime and look at them a little differently, you might notice that those clouds look kind of fake. Like if I saw that cloud in a movie or on a computer screen, you might think, oh, that doesn't look very good. But in reality, it could be a photo of a real cloud, and so it's just sometimes it's hard to think about what this actually would look like. But I think this is correct, so I'm not going to worry about it anymore. I'm going to move on with fixing the rest of the problems with this image. So a couple things to do. Our final gather is enabled, and a lot of the final gather rays are getting stuck behind these objects and in the shadows and in the corners here, because our final gather tracing is right now I've set to 1. So it's only allowing 1 ray through here, so reflections aren't making it through these objects. They're just bouncing off of one object and it's done. So I'm going to increase these to 4, 4, and the max trace depth to 8. And that's going to kind of lighten up these dark areas just a little bit. And also, you see we still have these weird bright areas in these where I expect this to be a little darker here, and I expect this shade of green to be a little darker here. So we're going to go to our light, and our ray depth limit for our ray traced shadows is set to 3. So I think we're losing some shadow rays. They're not making it through all these objects and back to the camera. So I'm just going to bump this way up to 12. And now let's see where we're at. Alright, now that's looking a little better. If we compare it to the previous image, take a look at the change in these areas here where you can see the square behind the square in front. There's just a big difference there. And also you can see a slight change in the brightness of the areas behind the glass squares, and that's from our increasing our final gather tracing. Just a subtle difference, but it's there. And so if we want to add a little more realism to this, then since these are transparent colored glass objects, the shadows really should be generated through caustics instead of we're just using ray traced transparent shadows right now. So we'll need to turn on caustics. If we were to first of all go to our light and come down to the mental ray section on the caustic and global illumination rollout, turn on emit photons, you'll see caustic photons is grayed out, and that's because caustics is not globally enabled yet. So let's go to our render settings, and you can do it from the features tab. You can turn on caustics here, but I prefer to come to the indirect lighting tab and turn on caustics here. It's the same thing, but this just lets you remember that you've got some options to play around with in here if you ever want to. So now that caustics is enabled, you'd think caustic photons would not be grayed out anymore, but it is, and that's just, we need to deselect and then reselect the light, and then it'll refresh, and now it's available. So now that we've done that, let's take a look at our render and see where we're at. Well, we've enabled caustics, and we've turned on emit photons on our light, and the render looks exactly the same as it did before. So what's going on? The reason is it has to do with our MIA material. If you come down to the Advanced Refraction section, there's these options right here. I can choose between refractive caustic or transparent shadow, and those have to do with when caustics is enabled, the MIA material is going to behave in one of these two ways. Right now it's set to transparent shadow. But we don't want that. We actually want to generate these shadows through caustics. So I'm going to switch this to refractive caustic, and I'm going to run through the other objects and change them all as well. Alright, now that we've done that, let's do another render. Alright, well now the render definitely looks different than where we were at. It doesn't look better though. The shadows look way too dark. And what's happening is there's two kinds of light intensity in play now. If we select our light, you've got your regular intensity up here, and now that we've enabled photons, we also have photon intensity to play with. It's the same thing. The photon intensity here is kind of the same thing as your light intensity here. It's just how bright things are. So our light is still illuminating these objects just as much as it was before, but now wherever photons or caustic photons come into play, we have a different control for that brightness, and that's going to be this photon intensity. And there are other ways of dealing with this. Instead of having to guess how bright the photons are supposed to be relative to the intensity of the base light, you do have a photometric light option. And actually, hold on, before I show you this, let me just show you. If I were to go into the node editor, and I'm going to create something called MIA photometric light. And this is a different kind of light. This is a mental ray light, and you can think of it as a point light, but it's supposed to be plugged into an area light. I'm not going to get too much into that with this video, but the point of this light is to take care of the intensity of the light versus the intensity of the photons. So if you were to use this light, you have to plug it into a Maya light to make it work. And once you've done that, you can one second. All right. So you would select your Maya light, and then you would plug it into this light shader and this photon emitter. You would plug that MIA photometric light node into here. Once you've done that, you'll find that this photon intensity no longer has any effect, nor does this intensity. They're both, it's controlled in the MIA light shader. So it takes care of how bright the photons are going to look for you based on some mathematical equation. And if you're interested, I do have a script available on Creative Crash that makes setting up that photometric light a lot simpler than how you have to do it in Maya without this script. So, but let's not do that right now. Let's just continue working with our regular light. So our photon intensity right now is 8,000, and apparently that's way too dark. So I'm going to increase that to, say, 80,000. And now let's see what our render looks like. Alright, well, it still looks a little dark, so let's take the 80,000 photon intensity and I'm going to turn it up to 110, and we'll see what that does. And also, you might think that it looks kind of low res, like the photons just, it looks kind of blurry and just blotchy. Let's do this. The caustic photons, it defaults to 10,000. That's actually not very many, so I'm going to turn that up to 100,000. Depending on what you're doing, you might even want to turn that up to 1,000,000, but you're going to have to pay for that with a longer render time. And on a side note, when you're using photons and global illumination in general, if you've got you want to make sure that your light source that's emitting the photons is closed off. Like in this case, this light is inside a cube. So I have a cube here, and I have the normals reversed on the cube, so they're all facing in. And the light is inside that cube. If the light were to be outside like this, then when it's emitting photons, sure, some photons are going to come in here and find these objects and do what they're supposed to do. But other photons are going to be shooting off into space. And if you have photons that shoot off into space and never intersect with anything, then for whatever reason, that will increase your render times quite a bit. So if you ever find that your renders are taking forever to just get through the photon emission phase, check and make sure that you don't have any lights out in space anywhere. They should be enclosed in an area. Alright. So I've gone from 10,000 to 100,000 photons, and I have increased the photon intensity. So let's do another render and see what that does. Alright, we're definitely brighter, and the caustic shadows look a little less blurry and smudgy than they did before. They still look like they could be a little sharper, so I'm tempted to turn this up to 1,000,000, but I'll turn it up to 400,000 caustic photons. And it's kind of grainy looking in these areas, and often that's caused by your ray trace shadows not having enough samples. But in this case, I did some experimenting, and it's actually being caused more by something else. But I do want to adjust our light. So the shadow rays here, 8 is a pretty good preview value, but you might want to increase this to 16 or 32 if you can afford the render times. It'll help remove some of the graininess in the shadows. I'm going to turn it up to 16. But the main culprit of this graininess I found was actually caused by the ambient occlusion that's part of the box environment that I've got here. I have a MIA material assigned to that box, and ambient occlusion is turned on. And I have that there because I want to really bring out the little corner here in the box, so I want to be able to see this the darker areas here where these two surfaces intersect. So I don't want to get rid of ambient occlusion. What you can do, you can turn up the samples, and that's going to increase your render time, but it's going to clean this up a bit. If I wanted to, I could also change the distance. Right now the distance is set to 5, which I believe is the height of these glass pieces. They're 5 units high. So I would like for them to interact with this wall. So if I were to turn this down to like 0.1, you'll still see the dark areas in the corner here, but it's going to lose contact with these objects around it. So which it'll probably fix a lot of this graininess, but I'll lose that little bit of depth. So I don't want to change that yet. Right now I think I just want to turn up the samples and see what that'll give us. So I'm going to increase the samples to 32. And like I said, that's going to increase the render time, but it sometimes you just got to do it. So let's see what that does. Alright, you can see some definite improvements now in the graininess in these areas if you compare it to the last image. It's improved quite a bit. It's still not perfect. I could continue to increase these samples or maybe take this distance down a little bit. I could also increase the darkness, or I'm sorry, add some brightness to the shadows, which would help it blend in more with the white wall here. But I'll call that good for now. The caustics are also a lot sharper. If you recall, we increased the caustic photons from 100,000 to 400,000, and that's made a definite difference. And for the purposes of this video, I think I'm going to call it good. You can see there's still more work to do with the appearance here. Things still do look a little smudgy. You might have to go into our caustic settings here and just start messing around with all this stuff and come down to these settings here. There's a lot to do, but hope you've learned a lot about how to set up the max distance settings within the MIA material, and I look forward to talking to you again.